Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today, we are going to be talking about exposure. Now, when we think about exposure, we're really talking about how do you get a good image using the three main components of taking any image, okay? And that is shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So the first thing to know really is how does a camera work, right? And in this case, we're going to look at a digital single lens reflex camera or a DSLR just to kind of get a good idea of kind of how these things are working, okay? First things first, we have our lens here. So if we look at any camera like this one here, we have our lens right in the front. Now all lenses come off, right? So then we're able to take our lens off and then change it out with another lens, right? Every lens has a aperture, right? An aperture is the size of the hole that lets light in, okay? Once you get into that camera, you have your shutter. The shutter is basically the little flap that allows light to hit the sensor. So if we think about this camera here, that little flash you just saw, that was the shutter opening and closing, letting the light come in and hit the sensor here, okay? Now, on the back of every camera, you also have your screen, which is like that, right? So the screen, sometimes you can look through there depending on what camera you have. And then also, no matter what, you have your viewfinder, okay? And then last but not least, you have your shutter button. You press this button and that's what takes the picture. Now, exposure is the amount of light which reaches the sensor in your camera, okay? So it's crucial to knowing how bright or dark you want your picture to appear, okay? So if we look at these three different pictures here, the one all the way on the left is underexposed, meaning that you didn't expose it enough to light. And the one on the right here, which is super bright and very white, is in fact overexposed. So what you're trying to do is balance how much light you have, which is where we get this center image. And that's essentially what you're shooting for every single time you take a picture. Now, the three different parts to this are you have your ISO, okay? ISO or ISO is essentially how sensitive you make your camera. The lower the number, okay, the lower the sensitivity to light, okay? So if it's really bright outside, you want to have a lower sensitivity. If it's really dark, you want to have a higher sensitivity. Your aperture is the size of the hole that lets light in, so the aperture is inside the lens. It controls how much light is getting in through the size of the hole. And then last but not least, if you can hear, that sound is your shutter speed, okay? Now, you can't just do one of these things to have a good image. You need to have a balance of all three to get yourself the perfect exposure. Now, to figure out what type of exposure you have is where you get your meter here, okay? All the way to the left where you have this minus, the image starts to get darker. So notice here we're at -2, okay? And then as we go further to the right here, we end up getting a +2, right? So notice how on the left, the image becomes darker, and on the right, the image becomes brighter. Always, always, always you're shooting for that sweet middle ground right in the center, okay? Now, sometimes depending on what look you want, you might want to overexpose it a little bit, or you might want to underexpose it a little bit, but generally you never want to go under this -1 or +1 because notice how we start to lose that detail of the sky. Now, how a camera generally works is light comes in through the lens and bounces off of the mirror, which then in turn hits another mirror, comes out the viewfinder. Now, when you take that picture and you press the button, the shutter on the camera opens to let the light pass all the way through. And then the light hits that sensor and the shutter speed measures how long that shutter is open for, which is the sound of that click that you hear when you press this shutter release button, okay? Now, shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second, okay? So if we look here, notice how we have all the way from 2 seconds all the way up to 1/1000th of a second. Now, depending on what camera you have, you'll have a much wider range. Now, generally, you can always have a camera shoot to an infinite amount of time. So you can have a camera take a picture for 4 hours, 14 hours, however long you want the exposure to be, okay? But generally speaking, unless we're trying to capture movement of, say, a night sky and try and track stars across the sky, you're generally going to be taking a picture at 1/60th of a second all the way up to 1/1000th of a second. This being because 1/60th of a second is the slowest you can take a picture by hand without getting too much motion blur. Once you go below 1/60th of a second, you need a tripod, or else your picture is going to come out blurry because your hands just generally shake, okay? So slower shutter speed, the number goes down and then starts to kind of go up again because you're going in seconds. And then when you go up to the right, you're breaking that number down into fractions. So even though 1/1000th seems like a high number, in reality, it's a fraction of that second, and it's 1/1000th of a second. Now, why would you want to have a fast shutter speed versus a slow shutter speed? Well, a slow shutter speed is going to capture movement, okay, or show movement. So notice how we're looking at this creek here and the water's coming through. And with the slow shutter speed, the water starts to look more like a blur, okay? So we have this blurry water flowing through, and it's a really, really cool effect. Now, if we wanted to capture some of that action in the moment, we would want to use a fast shutter speed so we can freeze that movement in that time, okay? So that way, if you're trying to get more of an action shot of, say, like a quarterback throwing a football, right, you're gonna wanna have a faster shutter speed so you don't get the blur of maybe him throwing that ball, which could also in turn be a cool effect as well. Now, again, we're balancing out, thinking about shutter speed, and then you're gonna have to also have an ISO that matches, and then your aperture. Aperture is the opening in your camera through which light travels through, okay? So think of it kind of like your eye, okay? So it essentially tells you how much light gets in. It also controls the depth of field, okay? Now, aperture is expressed in what we call f-stop numbers, okay? So you need to kind of think backwards on this. The lower the f-stop number, the larger the size of the hole, okay? So if you're at f-stop 1.4, the hole size is going to be very, very large, okay? If you're at f-stop f22, you're gonna end up having a really, really small hole, okay? So the smaller the number, the larger the hole. The larger the number, the smaller the hole. Generally speaking, this is what all of these charts are going to look like, okay? It's helpful to have around just to kind of know. I have a poster that's going to be up on the board, so if you ever need that as a reference, you'll always have that as that gauge to look at, okay? Depth of field is super important to know what you're trying to do, okay? Depth of field is the distance from one object in an image compared to another image and how sharp they are, okay? So depth of field is described as either shallow or large, okay? If we look at this image of this flower here on the left, we'll see that it's at f40, okay? Something I want to point out is, one, f40, the hole is really small, okay? The smaller the hole, the more of the background you're going to see, okay? So the higher the number, the smaller the hole, and the more background you're going to see. Think about, when you're trying to focus in on something, you want to really kind of make that much smaller so you can see the whole thing, okay? On the right, we have f3.5, which is a much, much, much smaller f-stop than f40. Notice that the size of the hole here is much, much bigger, and the amount of space we can see is a lot less, okay? So the higher the number, the smaller the hole. The lower the number, the bigger the hole, but the less of the background you're going to see. So if we look at this image of the cat here, we have a shallow depth of field happening because the cat in the front is going to be blurry, and so is the cat in the back. And only the subject in the middle is going to be sharp. And then the opposite's true here, where he's using a much higher f-stop number, and so he can have more clarity in the whole image in its own. So again, the smaller the hole, the more the background you'll be able to see. The bigger the hole, the less of the background you're going to see. So again, we have another example to sort of show this. F2, okay, the hole is much bigger. The monkey in the front is in focus and the blur of the fence is in the background. Versus F22, we have the whole thing is in focus, or at least is all sharp, okay? But again, the higher the number, the smaller the hole. The smaller the hole, the more background you're going to see. So again, we have another example here just showing depth of field. Here we have a narrow depth of field, so the only thing that would be in focus is going to be this bear. So that means we have a lower number, okay, or a bigger hole of an ISO or f-stop, I'm sorry. And then you're going to have your f22 here, so you'll have a much larger depth of field and everything else is going to be in focus versus just this bare. Now we've covered aperture and shutter speed. Now there's just one part of the puzzle that we need to talk about, and that is ISO, okay? In digital photography, ISO or ISO measures the sensitivity of the image sensor itself or the whole camera, okay? The higher the ISO means that your sensor becomes more sensitive to light, which allows you to see and get a clearer picture in the day, whereas a higher number, you are going to be able to see more in the dark, okay? Now, the thing about ISO here is that we have different types of grain happening, okay? So why would you want to shoot your photographs with a low ISO over high ISO? And here it is, okay? The higher the ISO, so for example, this camera here goes all the way up to 1200 and 12,900 is the highest ISO that this camera gets. The lowest is 100, okay? Now, if it's really dark outside and you're set your ISO at 100, you're not going to be able to get a good exposure. It's going to be way too dark all the time. Now, if you do the opposite and you have a high ISO during the daytime, your image is going to become grainy, okay? Now, the higher the ISO, you get more noise. So look how in the background this looks kind of pixelated and a little bit blurry versus where we have this over here is much smoother, much cleaner. So the higher the ISO, the more grain you're going to get, okay? Now, you always have to balance your image, and sometimes your image is just going to be a little more grainy depending on where you are and what the circumstances are, okay? So sometimes it's just really about balancing your image to just in the end get a good exposure so you can see what's happening in the moment. And essentially, ISO is that third part of the puzzle. Even though you have to have the settings on your camera set, it's always about trying to find the right ISO to then balance out with your shutter speed and your aperture. Now, also, if you want to play around with aperture, you also need to be aware of sort of the setting, right? You're not going to be able to get everything in focus because your hole is going to be smaller and you might have to have a very, very high aperture. So it's really about balancing and trying to figure out what you want to control your image.